Hey, Michael D'Amico here with eBike Motor Repair again. Got another video for you. Today we're going to be reviewing some typical problems that we see with the Bosch Generation 2, which will also cover some older units in terms of their basic construction. They look a little different just in color only, but nevertheless, this is going to be a kind of what's the matter with some of the first major generation Bosch CX performance line, a few other models that fit within the exact same mechanics, the same bits and pieces. But anyway, so let's get right into it. Come on over. So again, this is the Bosch Gen 2 that we're referring to here in this video. Some people will actually refer to this as the Generation 3, and it's understandable because it is kind of confusing. Bosch did release a sort of second iteration of its Generation 2, so it kind of got confused as the Generation 3, but the Generation 3 motor looks completely different than the Generation 2. Point in case, this is a Generation 3 motor in my hand. This is the Generation 2. We've certainly got a lot of orders for Gen 3 parts, and unfortunately they get their parts and they realize that they've ordered the wrong thing. So here we have kind of a lineup of some problem kids. Actually, we've got one new one here, but I just want to show you some comparisons with new versus what's happened with some of these. At any rate, this is going to kind of cover the whole Bosch Gen 2 and some earlier models because mechanically they are the same. For example, this is just an older version of what you're seeing right here. It just doesn't have the black paint on there. Anyway, we've got a really great example of kind of a worst case scenario motor here. This is not common, but you can still kind of get an idea of where we can get some water to come in. What's not common is this poor motor was submerged in a hurricane in Fort Myers. And I know from experience, having lived in Fort Myers, that yeah, it can get pretty brutal when it floods down there. So it's unfortunate, but a bike shop evidently got flooded and they just wanted to see if there was any chance in saving this motor. But all the seawater came into the internal motor and just corroded it so bad. I mean, they don't even spin freely anymore. There's tons of corrosion on here. But now, how did that water get in there? It's through this little hole right here. And by comparison, on a brand new motor, all that's keeping that hole closed is this little, it's just a little adhesive sticky tab. It's not technically a seal. I could pop that off of there real quick with my fingernail even. It's pretty easy to do. But ironically, the rest of this motor was okay for the most part. We've seen worse, considering, you know, the typical wear and tear parts. You know, a lot of times Bosch Gen 4 motors will come in kind of sounding like this. We haven't opened this one yet, but I can pretty much assume what's going on in this one. All right, so some common failure bearings that are most likely what are making this one sound so bad are the old worst one here is this left side. This crank bearing just is exposed to the outside. It's unfortunate, but when the shaft comes through the shaft comes through the case, a circlip goes right on that shaft right there and basically prevents that bearing from being sealed. So it's kind of exposed to the outside elements, and this one tends to go real common on this model motor. Some of the second worst ones we see is on this right side, the drive side case cover. You can actually see that, you know, this sprocket carrier bearing is completely seized in there. I can't even turn this. This should spin freely. As you can see on this one, I should be able to spin it. As a matter of fact, let's show you right behind this little guard here, this little sort of dirt dust guard seal is one of the right drive bearings. You can see it recessed right in there, and that's a really common one that fails. fact, that noise you're hearing is most likely just all kinds of crud that's gotten in there. And looking at the one I just showed you a second ago, it's gotten so bad that it doesn't even turn anymore. And then there's another bearing right down inside of this sprocket carrier. So you've got the drive bearing that kind of presses in. Let's show you an example. You can get this off here. So this drive bearing that I'm referring to is this one right here. Actually, let me get that seal off of there too. This bearing goes around the sprocket carrier and presses into the case cover, right? But down inside of the sprocket carrier is the support bearing for the actual crankshaft. So now we do make a seal that goes on that. Just recesses right around the crank shaft and protects this bearing. And we also make what's called a mud stop, which presses in, kind of replaces this part and goes around this little flange and really does a much better job of keeping the dust and whatnot out on the drive side of the motor. We made a video about mud stops. Check out our channel and see if you want to learn more about those seals and how to install them. So for sake of the movie, we'll just continue right along. Next up, what we see fail a lot of times are there's a couple of clutch bearings in these units, and one clutch bearing is right down inside of this little transfer gear, and this gear actually gets driven by the internal motor. So it'll move, the motor will move this gear, which will rotate this transfer gear, which will then deliver movement to the sprocket carrier, right? But inside of this transfer gear is a clutch bearing, and that's basically what that does, is it lets it free spin in one direction but grip in the other. So when it's going this way, it's slipping inside of there, and when it's going this way, it's not slipping. That's why I call it a clutch bearing. What will happen sometimes is these transfer gears can crack. It's hard to see. Even if I had an example of one, it wouldn't register necessarily that well on camera, but they are easy to see with the naked eye. Usually right down next or in between these teeth, you'll see a small hairline crack, and what that does is it can let this clutch bearing slip inside of here. Now that is actually something that's detected by the motherboard of the motor, and it'll actually throw an error code. Now that's an easy one to fix because our service kits will actually replace this part. So that's another part that typically will fail on you too. Now going a little deeper into the motor, there is a deep gear cluster which kind of supports some other parts on the shaft. There's a bearing here and a bearing here that let these little this little cluster of gears here rotate and spin freely. These aren't a common point of failure, but what we usually do is replace them during an overhaul anyway, because these two bearings that support this little cluster of gears, there's a shaft that goes all the way through, and they're super cheap. And it's, we're in here, kind of one of those proactive things, we might as well do it. But what you can see is a lot of times this corrosion has gotten onto this gear cluster. So it's good to just sort of take this whole component apart, give it a good bath, re-grease it. You can see even this little gear here has transferred a good amount of grease to this little cluster. So, there's just a needle roller bearing in there. This one usually doesn't give too much trouble because it's buried pretty deeply in the motor. But if you get this motor submerged in water, or you get a lot of water to get in here, yes, that can actually seize onto the shaft. Another thing that I actually see quite often is this whole support for this cluster can snap right here. We've tossed all of those. I don't have an example to show you, but they'll break right here. You'll kind of hear this whole drive assembly kind of shaking around in there, and then once you remove the entire drive assembly, we find that this has been cracked, and usually a piece of it's rattling around inside your motor. Not good. Something else that we see is the little circlips that actually hold this gear onto the shaft sometimes will just randomly break, and you'll get little bits of metal kind of flying around inside of your motor as well. Now we replace these with our service kit, so you know, even if they were fatigued for some reason in your motor, if we were to do the service, those would become, you know, you get brand new set in there. Sometimes on these shafts, because of corrosion, they'll get pitted so bad on some of these surfaces, like for example where I showed you the needle roller goes onto this shaft. It'll get so pitted on there that even if you replace the needle roller, the pitting on the shaft would damage a brand new needle roller. So in some cases we have to end up replacing this whole shaft. Again, at orientation, this is the left side of the unit, so you know, water and dirt and stuff comes in here, kind of coats all of this and gets in there and sits and pits and corrodes and, you know, causes basically irreparable damage. We've had a lot of questions like, oh, well, couldn't I just throw that on a lathe and knock off a few thousandths of an inch? Well, no, you can't, because these tolerances are designed to be very specific, right? So if you do that, you're going to get, you know, slop that it wasn't designed for, and most likely still end up killing your needle roller bearing too. Anyway, so here's another unusual circumstance, but still nonetheless it's not impossible to happen. We have seen it on multiple occasions. I showed you a moment ago how the internal motor drives this gear, which then drives some gears in the right side case cover, but this particular gear has a little supporter, a little support pin in there. So this gear will rest right on that pin. And what can happen sometimes is, over time, so much spinning, or if this bearing fails, it'll grab onto this pin and it can just rip it right out of the case, which is exactly what happened here. And you can see by comparison the difference in those surfaces. You see a machine surface on this one to hold this pen in place, which supports the tip of that bearing, giving it stability. And as soon as that bearing were to seize, it becomes unstable, and bingo, you get kind of a meltdown situation. We were able actually to desolder the motherboard and pull the magnets. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before or not, but on this particular motor, you know, this magnet armature was so damaged that it's game over for this motor, because the magnet armature has a distinct polarity, and the angle of that polarity is synchronized and keyed into this specific motherboard. So these aren't really interchangeable parts. So back to this motor, that was what we did, is we actually pulled the magnet armature out, removed the motherboard by desoldering this right here, and then essentially having a donor case just like it, putting the magnet in, soldering the motherboard into the donor motor, and we were able to get the guy going again, even though this is, you know, kind of where he landed. Intense, but nevertheless fixable. Sometimes I don't have an example, but sometimes we have opened these up and some of the circuitry just looks like a little lightning bolt went off. I mean, that's pretty obvious when we pull those open. If we have a fatal error code on a diagnostics or something to that effect, you can pull it open and sometimes actually see where it physically arced. You know, it's definitely game over for that too, because again, the same reason we can't interchange magnets, we also can't interchange motherboards. I've seen when a motor seizes, I have seen them actually fry a motherboard. Something about going from, you know, some sort of high load situation to all stop has absolutely, from time to time, caused current problems. I'm assuming that's a little bit out of my pay grade as to why it happens, but we've seen it happen before. Not often, but it can occur. Here's actually a kind of a rare situation on this motor. If you look on the new motor, this is where the power cord coming from the battery plugs into the unit. And this customer snapped his off, and there's really nothing we can do about that. It goes through the case to the outside of the unit. Those are soldered directly to the to the motherboard. So since this snapped off, it's game over for this guy's motor as well, unfortunately. I have seen these actually, you know, strip out teeth. You know, these little motors are extremely powerful, and yeah, these little plastic gears, while they are amazing material, can occasionally fail. And you can see these strip out. As you can see, that's a metal drive gear, and of course this is plastic, so occasionally we will see these teeth strip out. So that pretty much wraps up what we see commonly on the Bosch Gen 2. Sure, we actually covered some things that are uncommon. We love uncommon stuff. If you've seen some weird, odd, bizarre things, send it over. I'd love to take a look at it. Let's see. Anything else really from this point? We would be in new territory from the point of making this video. If you have any questions or ideas or other videos you want to see, definitely leave them in the comments. Everything that we've covered here, we have overhaul kits for these motors. We have service kits, which replaces that whole drive side cover and all of the gears that are inside of there. We also have all the seals that we've discussed in this video as well. Thanks for watching.